Wilbraham, found in the beautiful rolling hills of western Massachusetts. It is as much a part of its landscape as it is a part of small-town New England history. It is sustained by a thriving community whose people call these lands home, preserved by their care by a community that wishes to see Wilbraham endure. And it will endure, because this is our town. We remember our history, our family, our community. We remember our story. Originally, the area was inhabited by the Nipmucks.
The Nipmucks were the Indians that were here. And originally they farmed and fished and hunted and did their thing and didn't bother anybody. And William Pynchon, and he was a pretty wealthy guy, and he figured out that there was all this land out here to have, so he made a deal with the Indians. Well, he bought some of the land. I don't know how he got the first part, but anyway, he eventually worked with the Indians and he bought the rest of it for 6 strings of beads from 3 Indians. They sold him the land. So when after the land was bought, then nobody lived in, I don't think for about 50 years, nobody, a lot of people came from Springfield and did hunting, and the Indians were still allowed to hunt and pick berries and everything. And then slowly people began to kind of move out here.
As Wilbraham continued to develop, its own nation did too. By the late 18th century, colonies that later became the United States revolted from their mother country, Great Britain. On their way to liberate Boston, rebel soldiers traveled through Wilbraham via what was known as the Knox Trail.
Knox Trail, Henry Knox coming through here. Wow, that was something.
General Knox went all the way to Fort Ticonderoga, New York. It was mind-blowing. Got the cannons from there. This was on the command of George Washington, who said, we need those cannons. They went and got the cannons and dragged them all the way down through these rough roads and over land that, it's so hard to think how they would have done it.
Boston won because of Henry Knox getting to Boston with all the artillery. Then Burgoyne's troops were marched back through here and actually were bivouacked in what is Mass Mutual's grounds.
It was tremendously important in the Revolutionary War and
Following the American Revolution and amidst national discontent, New England farmers led by Daniel Shea attempted a rebellion.
Shays' rebellion, they came down from more rural areas and camped here in Wilbraham for a little while before they were going to go into Springfield to attack the army.
And so they were tired of taxation, and so they decided to revolt. And when they came through, they stayed, some of them bivouacked down here at the turkey farm.
So they stayed in my grandfather's house, on the turkey farm.
That if they could detain them long enough, they could get word to the armory they were coming. Because what they were doing was they were going to go to the Springfield Armory and take all the guns and the ammunition from there.
They were intoxicated. They were partying soldiers, like a lot of soldiers are. And the story goes from the history that they stuck their bayonets in the ceiling of the bedroom. They stayed in the bedroom, they stuck the bayonets to the ceiling and left them there as they were partying. And then in the morning they left.
The Ace of King was his name. He took off on a horse and rode down Stony Hill Road into Boston Road and then on down to the Armory, and he informed Shepard, who was, I believe he was the head of the Armory, gave him enough time so that when Shays' troops came, they were ready for him. They told him, to stop. Well, some of them didn't want to. They were all riled up and, big mob. And so he said, we'll shoot. And they kept coming in. So they shot over their heads, but they also shot, a couple of men did die. And they backed up and ran all the way to 5 Mile Pond.
And then eventually the rebellion was broken up.
That was the end of Shays' Rebellion. You know.
Alongside his participation in national history, Wilbraham contains stories that stand by themselves, making this town unique.
Timothy Merrick was a young man who was a farmer and was engaged to a woman. I believe her name was Sarah Lamb. And he was going to be married in a very short time. And in those days, you didn't have a lot of shoes to wear, so a lot of the farmers farmed barefooted. And he went out to cut hay, I believe it was. And he was working down in there, and it was a hot summer day, and a rattlesnake bit him. And I guess in those days they didn't get to him fast enough for when he died overnight.
It was a big tragedy in town. They wrote a song about it. They buried him in Adams Cemetery.
As Wilbraham grew in population, its people desired a church of their own.
The churches have always been a big part of this town. Churches are a big part of any, the beginning of anywhere. First of all, you got to have a church, you got to have a preacher, so you have to find somebody that wants to come in and be a preacher. Well, Noah Merrick was the first preacher this town had here. Well, when they built the first Congregational church, they decided that they would build it up on Wigwam Hill. 50 years that church sat there, and people from town, in the winter, in the spring, went up that hill. And of course, in those days, people spent the whole day at church, and everything, and down the hill. Well, finally, after 50 years, they decided, this is really getting to be monotonous. We need to move that church. So they moved it to, I believe it was where the gazebo is now, and it burned. And then they built another one, and it burned. That's the 4th Congregational church in this town. And then they built this one, which has survived. But it's pretty interesting. At that time, all there was a Congregational church. Long, long time ago in the 1800s, there was a Baptist church on Boston Road. It burnt down too. Collins Mills used to be there. It was a big, big paper mill. In fact, Grace Union Church was started by the Collins family, was quite large and, contributing money to get that church started.
Amidst a civil war between a slaveholding South and abolitionist North, Wilbraham played its own role.
The stories are that, yes, they did, and supposedly there's an opening in the wall down in the basement that has been cemented over, where supposedly they went through. However, we do know for a fact that there was a trustee at the academy whose wife's great-grandfather went through the Underground Railroad up Mountain Road, and she has verified that there is record that he did. I was told there's a house here in town too that they harbored them in the basement, and the basement was all dirt, and it was not very tall, so they had to lay until it was safe to go on. It's kind of interesting to think that we might have been a part of freedom.